Good morning, friends. Today is Thursday, August 26th, the 18th of Elul. We're studying the entire Talmud presently, or I should say we're studying the entire Talmud one day, one page, one line at a time. Presently, Maseches Shabbos, chapter 7. We are on 73b, the 7th chapter, studying about the 49 Melachos. I am reporting from my alternate studio, and as you hear, there is a little noise in the background. I want to thank you in advance for your accommodation. I'm teaching and also keeping an eye on our brachi. Nurse didn't show up, so I'll ask for your patience if there's a little background noise in studio. And today we're dedicating our learning for a speedy and complete refuah for Leah Bas Rita. Now, Beryl, you told me you have yard sites, or am I mixing things up?
Yeah, I have your site today for my grandmother, Mina Bazdov.
So we're gonna dedicate our learning to the grandmother of Beryl, Mina Bastov. She certainly gets a share in the credit for what a Talmud Chacham and a not just a scholar of Torah, but a valuer of Torah. And so her neshama should have an aliyah, and we're grateful and happy to be able to dedicate our learning for her memory. And of course, here is an open invitation for the mainstay, for the members of our chabura. We're always happy to dedicate and honor a session for a yard site, a parent, a grandparent, another family member. And the main thing is we should have an abundance of good news and goodness for all of Klal Yisrael, for the world over. As we approach a new year, pray for a peace, prosperity, bracha for Eretz Yisrael, for Klal Yisrael and the world over. Today, just before we start, is Chai Elul, the 18th of Elul. So as a Chabadnik, I gotta give the plug. Today is the birthday of the Baal Shem Tov and the Baal Tanya, the Alter Rebbe. And it is also, as you may know, the history of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov lived at a time where most of the Kabbalists and the class of, I don't know if you call them the tzaddikim, they were hidden tzaddikim. We all know about the Lamed Vavniks. So there was a class of hidden tzaddikim, Chasidei Ashkenaz, and they would roam around and do different spiritual things, and sometimes what we call segufim, deprivation, flagellation. This was their way of serving Hashem. And the Baal Shem Tov was also part of that movement. So the people saw the Baal Shem Tov, they saw him as a simple bahelfer, a simple, today we'd say a bus driver. He would help get the kids to cheder. And many of the tzaddikim of his ilk were happier being under the radar and low keys, less pressure. And the Baal Shem Tov receives messages from his mentors at a certain point that it's time to, the Jews really need help, and he's going to have to blow his cover. And the Baal Shem Tov resists, and ultimately it is on his birthday, I believe his 36th birthday, where he agrees, and that's when his career of what we know about the Baal Shem Tov begins. And so today is a special day. It is also 12 days until Rosh Hashanah, 12 days till the end of the year. And in the Hasidic tradition, we do a special teshuvah, 12 days, 12 months. So every day until Rosh Hashanah, you focus on another month. So today would represent last year Tishrei. And so I can't think of a better way to spend such a special day, but filling it with Torah. And so that's what we're going to do. So let's hit the screen, and we shall begin our journey through Shas. Let me just close these windows that are, well, actually, hold on. Tell me if you lose my screen. You see the screen or not?
Yes.
It's the Gemara?
Yes, but not anymore. It was on.
All right, so let me reassign. These mix-ups are a small price to pay for this wonderful technology that allows us to do this. All right. So again, we read the Mishnah. We spent 2 days. I'm sorry. We spent 2 days exploring the Mishnah. Okay, I'm hearing my voice, so I'm going to hit mute all and be so kind as to unmute yourself so we could have our always important conversations, dialogues, questions, comments. We've been studying the Mishnah, 39 Melachos, and presently we are reviewing the first round of Melachos, which we've described as Sidura, the pas, the Melacha, the labors, the necessary steps that lead one to having a loaf of bread. Today we just go to the store and buy a loaf of bread, but we shouldn't take for granted how that loaf of bread got to be in our table. And that's one of the nice things about exploring and examining the Siddur the Pas, we're forced to realize that somebody was schwitzing to get our bread to us, and someone was doing all that labor. And those exact labors are prohibited on Shabbos. And we've gone from a basic list to the Gemara presenting us with nuanced variations of that said malacha. And I pointed out yesterday that some languages will have a single word for multiple activities that all fall into the same category, but we could also have different and specific words to describe the same act in different industries. And that's what we've discovered already a few times in the laws of Shabbos, where the Hebrew language is quite expressive. And so there's a separate word for harvesting grain, and there's a different word for collecting grapes, and there's another word for collecting olives, and on and on. And ultimately, although they are different words, it's the same concept and the same thing. Actually, I'm sorry, I misspoke. For planting all of those items. And we were introduced to the Chiddush, which is that even pruning, which is taking away from the tree, could also be considered a subcategory, a tulda, an offshoot of planting. And here's where we came to realize that sometimes the undoing is the doing. So sometimes you're placing a plant in the ground, and sometimes you could be cutting something off the tree. But if its objective is to facilitate growth, that would be a tulda of planting. We also were introduced to the fact that sometimes you could do a single act, a single malacha, but actually be on the hook for two malachas if you have two different objectives that are both achieved with the single activity. I should just note, it is kind of surprising that you should do one act and have to do two atonements, but this is actually the flip side of what we've said about meleches machshavas, the value of intention and kavana, dare we say, in the melachos of Shabbos. So on one hand, sometimes if your intention is not the malacha, you could be off the hook, but by the same token, that could sometimes cost you twice when your machshava is for two different results, even if you do a single activity, because the value of machshava can sometimes multiply and sometimes subtract from the classification of what one is doing. Now, I want to point out that machshava is important. And so it's possible that an onlooker won't know about those two things. So when we're talking about a court of law, one may not be liable two times. But here, what we've been discussing is primarily a person's inner desire to do teshuvah, and an inner desire to get things right. So a person that made a mistake they hadn't intended to do, and they regret it, and they want to atone. And so therefore, all of what we're talking about now is about self, for the most part, I should say, is self-reporting. It's a person on their own. And so I think it's worthwhile to consider that. So anyways, that is all that's all an introduction that gets us up to this point. So we spoke about planting, different terms considered a malacha. We spoke about plowing, how plowing generally is an implement breaking up the earth for the purpose of placing in seeds, but sometimes you might do it with your hand, or sometimes you may make a trench. And if those both are facilitating the agricultural process, they too can be considered an agricultural act of chayresh, of plowing. We then spoke about how sometimes a single act could have multiple or varying definitions depending on where they take place. And so yesterday we spoke about removing a pile of earth or filling a pile of earth. Now, sometimes that would be fixing up your home, then it's called boina, construction. Sometimes it's facilitating, making your field worthy of planting. Well, then that's considered plowing, rather, chayrish, prepping the earth for a seed. Now we're going to see another thought-provoking and somewhat elementary aspect of Shabbos, but we're really starting from the ground up. And so now we're going to start building on our Gemara's analysis of the Melacha Chayresh plowing. We're now going to expand our thoughts. Is this text smaller than usual? Doctor, everyone's muted. Please unmute. Is the text, do I need to enlarge the text a little bit?
More or less the same, a little bit smaller.
Yeah, let's see if this is better.
A little bit smaller.
Okay, is it better now? I just
Yes, better.
Okay, very good, very good. All right, now let's start. Amar Rabbi Abba. Rabbi Abba. I think we've already heard from him a bit. Amar Rabbi Abba. The cursor is on the Hebrew words. Hachoifer guma b'Shabbos. A person who digs a hole on Shabbos. And generally, you're not allowed to dig a hole on Shabbos. And if a person hits all of the criteria for it to be a biblical prohibition, well, then there is a melacha. But here, let's see, he digs a hole. His objective, his end goal, what he desires is not to have a hole. He's making a hole, but he doesn't want the hole. Well, then why in heaven's name is a person digging a hole if he doesn't want a hole? And so Rashi, and I think Rabbi Steinsaltz point out, I'm sorry, I skipped the line of the Gemara. The Gemara says, his whole objective here is not the hole, it's the earth. Sometimes you need earth, but not the hole. The malacha of chayrish, of plowing, or the issue of digging, which is possibly an offshoot of either plowing or building, as we discussed yesterday. That would be if you want the hole. But here he wants the earth. Patur aleha. He is exempt. Not that you can do this, but you're exempt from having done a biblical malacha. Let's see Rashi. Ela le'afara. Well, in today's day and age, we're very blessed. But once upon a time, you needed earth in your facilities, in the restroom, to cover up that which you would rather keep covered up. We actually read it in the Chumash. Again, we're not going to go too far down this road, don't worry. But we read two Shabbos ago, right? Or was it last Shabbos? I don't remember anymore. The sanctity of the camp entailed, among other things, covering up human waste. And so, in today's world, we're very blessed. We have indoor plumbing, and we shouldn't take it for granted. But in those days, sometimes you needed earth, even if it meant it was a detriment to your land or to the floor in your house. So Rashi says, you're exempt. And this is not construction. Ultimately, your house is not enhanced at all. It's actually somewhat diminished if you have a hole in the middle of your home. If you'd ask a person, would you rather a hole in your home or not? They'd probably say they'd rather have a smooth floor. It'll get a higher appraisal. You want to have smooth flooring. This also cannot be considered prepping the earth, plowing for planting, because it's indoors. And most people don't have gardens inside of their homes, especially in those days where there probably wasn't much sunlight in their home, right? Suppose your home had a need for a hole, for whatever reason, for storage, I don't know. Then, if ultimately, for whatever reason, your home is enhanced and everyone's got to have a ditch, you can count on salespeople to the home has a hole, they'll turn it into a selling point. If the person wants the hole, then it's considered baina. But otherwise, it's not considered the malacha of building because you don't desire, it's not beneficial. And as you recall, we said that all of the malachas need to be constructive, contributing something positive in the malacha that you're doing. Here, you don't intend for the whole. It's not constructive for you. You simply need it for a secondary purpose. That's not considered malacha. Rebbe, go ahead.
And does the Talmud consider something that one could not have known in advance? When he did it, he wanted only the earth. A month later, for some reason, that hole is helpful to him. You have a problem?
I don't believe that's the case. We're looking here very much at a person's mentality in the moment of the act. So even if retroactively it became beneficial, I don't think that's enough. No, that is not enough to retroactively convert a not malacha act into becoming a malacha. So here, it's being mekalkel. You're damaging your home. If you notice, Rashi doesn't talk about meleches machshavas yet, or tzricha legufa rather. Rashi here is saying simply it's unconstructive. And the reason why he does that is because let's look at the next line of the Gemara. Afilu the Rabbi Yehuda, even though we have a minority opinion in the Talmud, who says as follows: the Amar Malacha she'ena tzricha legufa chayiv, a labor that you do that you don't actually need the result of the malacha. You're doing it for another purpose. You're digging a hole, but you don't need a hole. You just need the earth. So the malacha is digging a hole, but you actually don't need the hole. You just need the earth. He would say that's malacha she'ena tzricha legufa. You don't need the result of the malacha. He would still say you're chayiv. Hani mili misakin. That's when ultimately what you're doing is also contributing to what you need. Hai mikalkalu. Here ultimately, not only is it not, you're not doing the hole for the hole. You're not even left neutral. You're left with a situation of damage. Rashi. What would be an instance of misaking? So this is it's important that we have an example. Rashi is doing something very important. So Rashi tells us later on in the Gemara, there is a discussion. Tragically, a person passes away. So the person's remains need to be moved. Let's read Rashi. When a person transports human remains to bury. This is a very interesting idea, but let's just take Rashi at his word. On Shabbos, a person passes away, and there are different reasons why a person would rather not have a corpse in their home on Shabbos. And so they might desire optimally to have the remains moved to a funeral home or wherever else, let's say. So why are you moving the body? Because you need the body somewhere else, or because you don't want the body in the house? So the Rashi tells us, and the Gemara says, that ultimately you don't want a dead body, you don't want a corpse, and your main objective, besides for bringing it to Kfura, is that it should be in an appropriate place and not in your home. So if you have a tool and you need the tool at a work site, so you transport the tool, that's considered misakin. That's, you need to carry the item because it'll be useful there. By the mess, at least the way Rashi is learning it, and I understand why this might bring up some questions, and I want to explore it more. But Rashi is saying basically, he's not saying, Rashi is quoting the Gemara that describes that the moving of a mess is not because the mess is going to contribute something somewhere else. It's because you necessarily need to care for the mess, but not that it's going to make a contribution. And so suffice it to say, whether we like that example or not, that there are scenarios where transporting something or doing any of the malachis is constructive, even if it's not tzricha legufa. So there, you don't need the corpse to do anything, but you want it. That's considered misakin. It's constructive, even though you're not carrying it to use. Then Rabbi Yehuda would say you're chay. But in a case where you're actively breaking up your house for a secondary purpose or an alternative purpose, that's not considered a malacha because it is ein tzrich legufa, and it's also detrimental, damaging, or breaking down instead of building up. The Rashi reminds us there are times that you might need a hole, and then you would be chayav. Admittedly, this is a little bit more abstract, let's say. Any questions or comments before we jump into the next one?
Rabbi, it's a very complicated example to use.
It is.
You have the mitzvah, how great the mitzvah is with the mace, all kinds of other issues that you can't just gloss over.
No, but here's the point. At this point, we're looking very, very, is the word clinically? Is there a material construct? We're not even looking at a mitzvah. We're looking, is there a material contribution made by the human remains? Will it do anything good for something else? The answer is no. Why do we bury human remains? To honor the human remains. Not because the human remains are going to do something for us. We don't use a corpse. And so here, usually you transport something to benefit your objectives. Here, your whole only objective. I understand why it's confusing. That's why I'm confused. That's why it's a little bit hard to tie down. Because ultimately,
you're benefiting from performing this huge mitzvah.
Indeed. Look, when we get to the Gemara in Parak HaMatzniah, we'll dig down deeper into this very example. Rashi, I suppose the reason why Rashi is giving us this example is so we should be familiar with the example or the citation. But the bottom line is Rabbi Yehuda would tell you, In a case, although you're not going to be putting the thing you're carrying to use, namely the corpse, but ultimately it's misaking. So we have two things. We have the use and the fact that it's positive. Misaken is positive, kilkel is negative. And then we have the use of the item that you're carrying. Anyways, Dr. Hammer, you're muted, but we love you to.
It's not actually always true that you're not going to have any use for it. So my question is, if you do have a use for the mace, if it's for a transplant, a heart transplant.
That's a very interesting.
And somebody's waiting for a heart transplant, and it's Shabbos. Okay, and you're a doctor, so you know, because you work in the hospital and you're a cardiologist, and you know it's actually one of your patients is in the hospital waiting for a heart transplant, and now unfortunately your relative just passes away. The question then is, are you Mechalel Shabbos?
Doctor,
yeah.
I gotta tell you, that was a brilliant point. I'm so glad you made it. In the time of the Gemara, of course, they didn't have the notion of transplants, but this is a very, very good point and a very good question. Now, ultimately, we all understand that that to save a person's life, you're allowed to be Mechal Shabbos. So ultimately, we're not going to consider this a melacha in that a person should be Mechal Shabbos to save a life. But you've brought us a very good example of how perhaps there's more to the story, or we at least need to consider this other facet, which is in today's world, it's plausible that you could actually be using the human remains beyond just interring them. That's very, very interesting. And it's so interesting. I have a feeling it's discussed somewhere in contemporary halacha. And I don't have a citation for you, but that's an instance where I think our study here is extremely enriched by our diverse perspectives. Thank you, Doctor. So I'm not going to give a final psak on that. Not psak. Is that considered hoitzah? Probably. But that's a very, very good thing that we probably wouldn't have considered otherwise. A yasher koyach for that. Okay. And if I come across, I'm sure in the halachic journals, this is something that comes up. So if I come across something, I'll send it your way. And shkoyach for that. Any other comments before we go to the next thing? All right. So now we've gone through Zoyre, planting, Choresh, plowing. And by way of that, of course, plowing, we had the opportunity to have a few different discussions on the alternate actions that are basically fall into the same category as plowing. The fact that not all holes are created equal. Where you dig the hole is very important for considering if that act is a melacha or not. What you have in your head when you make the hole is very important when it comes to weighing how to respond. Again, we're talking in the context of tshuva or what to do after melacha. Now we're going to go to the third melacha in the Mishnah, koitzer, which is translated as reaping. I believe koitzer is, although I think koitzer can more broadly be a word that means to cut off, because that what sira means to cut, but the word koitzer is primarily used in a grain context. Sidura de pas, we're talking about getting bread, and so in bread you're harvesting the grain. Alan, are you on?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question pertaining to the whole. They used oil in those days, and I'm sure they used oil to cook. So what happens if they have a little fire in their on the stove, and they take a shovelful of the earth that's on the floor to smother it?
So your questions are good because they challenge me. So I want to just say briefly, that's a very good question. So there's two issues here. There's the issue of, is the digging of the hole considered a malacha of digging a hole, chayfer? And based on our Gemara, most likely not, because you're digging the hole not for the purpose of having a hole. You're digging a hole for the purpose of using the earth. The next question, which we're going to address shortly in our analysis of this mission and down the line, actually we discussed it also in the past, is mechaber, are you allowed to put out a fire on Shabbos? And so that is a second melacha. You're not allowed to put fire out on Shabbos. The question that we'll have to explore is, are there scenarios where you're allowed to put out fire? And I'm going to remind you now, Dr. Hammer, when we were learning this, Ben Madlikin reminded us of a terrible event that he witnessed of a neighbor that had a fire. And so that reminded us that it's a highly sensitive and important conversation. So, but just to get to the answer of your question, in a sense, there's two things happening here. There's the extraction of the earth, which is probably not considered a malacha of chayfer, of digging, but assuming that he wasn't meant to put out the fire, that might be considered mechaber. The other thing we'll need to consider now, based as we get into our understanding of tzarich gufay, is putting out a fire for the purpose of not having your home burned down. Is that considered a malacha or not? Are there any opinions that would vary? But the long story short, shouldn't do it unless it's an emergency. So
There was one more thing I wanted to say.
Go ahead.
Pertaining to what Dr. Hammer said. When somebody's brought into the emergency on Shabbos, are they allowed to use a defibrillator on him? They're doing it to save his life.
So of course they can. The general rule is like this: to save a life,
You can break the rules.
you can break any rule of Shabbos.
Yeah.
And there's even more than that. Sometimes they say mitzvah begadol. You shouldn't pause. You shouldn't ask a question. You should go ahead and do it. Don't even
Don't hesitate.
don't hesitate for a second. And if you're not sure, maybe the person's life is not in danger, but maybe he is,
Still do it.
do it. And afterwards, you can ask the question for next time. But even if there's a doubt, if it's about saving a person's life, we can desecrate every aspect of Shabbos. Reb Beryl. I just want to know, we are veering off the road here, but go ahead, Reb Beryl. Final comment on this.
Alan, the same thing with the fire. First put out the fire and then go ask the rabbi if you did the right thing.
Hashtag this is not a psak. All right.
Generally, in a fire, if you're in an apartment, you got to put out the fire because it's the kind of neppish for your neighbors.
Just again, I want to remind everyone we discussed this.
In a house in the middle of a field, it might be a different story,
Yeah. All right. Our mission now goes on to the third item. Shpeich, everyone. All very good and enriching comments. Hakoitzer, one who reaps. Tana. So now we're going to have a sefta that's going to broaden our horizons on this concept. Hakoitzer, reaping, harvesting grain. Haboitzer, picking grapes. Vihagoider, collecting dates. Vihamasik, and collecting olives. Rashi. Goider, tamarim, that's collecting dates. Moisek, collecting bezesim. And lastly, vihaoida, and when harvest, figs. Rashi. Oida b'teinim. So basically, as I pointed out to you yesterday, the Hebrew language has a lot of nuanced language regarding agriculture, and ultimately, Kitsira, the malacha of harvesting, ultimately covers all of these different acts of harvesting, even though they have a different word in the Hebrew language. I'm sorry. So there's different languages, and even though the technique is, of course, different, there are different techniques for harvesting grain, collecting olives, and the like. Kulan, melacha, achas. They are all ultimately a single melacha, the melacha of removing agricultural products, plants from their source. Okay, this is not much of a chiddush. This is along the lines of what we were probably expecting based on our previous two elaborations on the malachos. Amar Rav Papa. Rav Papa now throws us a curveball. Haiman, the shada pisa ledikla. A person Who throws? Let's see what Rabbi Steinsaltz tells us. Earth, a clod of earth. To a dekel, to a date tree. The asar tamri, and it causes tamarim, dates, to come down. Oh, Rashi here. I skipped these Rashis. The shada pisa ledikla, throwing earth. Zorak pisas regavim ledekel, throwing a chunk of compressed earth. What did Rabbi Steinsaltz translate it as? A clod of earth. Okay. The asar tamari, and it causes hishira tamarim. The dates come down. So have you done a malacha? You're doing pitching. You're practicing your pitch, and you're throwing it. You want to practice your accuracy, and so you're throwing it at dates. Okay, I'm kidding. Obviously, it would have to be that you intend to get these dates done. Chayev shtayim. One could find themselves on the line for two malachas. Which two actions? Achas mishum toilesh. Number one, you're doing toilesh. Toilesh is you are removing, detaching the fruits from the tree. Rashi tells us this is a tulda de kaiser, and this is a byproduct. This is a spin-off of harvesting. Why is it? Hold on. Okay, we'll get there in a second. The achas mishum mifarek. Number one, you're detaching the item from the tree, and number two, mifarek, you are extracting the fruit from something else. We'll see in a moment. Rashi. Toileish told the kaiser. This is a byproduct of harvesting. Mifarek told the dash. This would be a variation of dash, which we said was threshing. What's threshing? Threshing is that by applying pressure in a certain technique, we can separate the the part of the grain that you want, the kernel of wheat, from what it is contained within, with its husk and whatever else. So mifarek, which is removing good from its packaging, let's call it for the moment. Told the dash. Mifarek tivua mishivla. What is dash? You're essentially extracting the kernel from the husk. Lashon porik min chamor. This is akin to the language of unloading a donkey.
Rabbi,
Yes.
how is this? What about intention? How does it plug into this discussion?
We're going to go.
This case different from like digging a hole for a different purpose, like we discussed at the beginning.
Indeed. That's why, if you notice, I corrected myself. I was being cute by saying he's practicing his pitching, but then I took that back because it's going to have to be that he wants the fruits. And let's say the fruit is high up and he can't reach it, so he throws the clump of earth to remove the fruits. You're 100% correct. There would have to be intention here. But the Gemara is now we're going to get now a little bit into like, why are we considering this two different acts? How is it considered two different acts? So again, so there's two things. There's the removing the item from where it's growing, from its source, and then there's the extraction of the part of the fruit that you want from the part that you don't want. And that's what mefarek is. Mefarek is removing the thing from within its natural, God-created container. You're extracting it. So the commentaries, and for some reason Rashi doesn't explicitly comment on this. So what happens is, anyone ever see dates grow? So apparently they grow in somewhat of a cluster. Is that true? I'm sure I've seen date trees, but they have somewhat of a cluster. And so two things are happening. You harvest. I'm going to give you the explanation that I saw in the Mesifta based on other commentaries. What's happening here is two things. When you usually harvest dates, you want to cut the cluster. Maybe there's another word for it, but it comes in a whole bunch. And then you we'll pluck off the individual dates to prepare them for marketing. Now, Mark and Alan or anyone else that knows a little bit more about how dates work, the date is exposed, right? So it's not actually contained within another compartment, correct?
Yeah, the ones I saw aren't the same ones that like the ones we usually get. They were the round ones. But it's a palm tree. They were like they would fall down individually.
Right. No, so usually we see them. Well, first of all, like this in Florida, date trees, the environment doesn't allow dates typically to ripen. You know that? So what happens is for beauty.
In my backyard in Boca, we're not very good.
Right. So for decorative purposes, in Florida, there's a whole market for date trees. They're quite costly. But the Florida environment, for whatever reason, is not conducive for the full ripening of dates. This I know. And that's why we get our dates from California or from the Mediterranean, Israel. But Florida dates, I don't think you'll find, and they're not that tasty. And Mark is giving us firsthand the edus to this fact. So ultimately,
Rabbi.
Hold on. Let me just finish. Hold on. 1 second. So ultimately, if I understand the commentaries that I'm reading here correctly, one second, please. There's 2 steps conceptually that are happening according to Rav Papa. Usually, you would have to sever the cluster, and then you would separate each of the figs from dates from the cluster. Here, by throwing the clod of earth, you're accomplishing both objectives at the same time. You're getting the individual fruit out of its cluster and then off the tree. And so Rav Papa is saying that conceptually, with one throw, you're achieving 2 objectives. The cluster is off the tree and the fruit is accessible and ready. Now, Mark is telling us that in Florida, they fall down individually and they're not ready. So that's obviously no. So that's what Rav Papa says. Now, hold on. I want to hear what Rav Beryl has to say now that I said that. Rav Beryl, go.
Where I saw them.
Rabbi, all the forbidden activities, threshing and all that, is your due. You're doing something to produce something.
Right.
It says to pick you got to pick them to eat them. Here, when they fall accidentally, it's very, very different. You haven't accomplished anything.
That's what the professor asked. The professor said, "Are you intending to remove the trees, or are you just a very bad pitcher?" And so, or a tennis. So that's what we're saying. No, it's obvious that here the person is intending to remove these fruits. And so it's not the typical manner of removing the fruits, which is going to be the next comment in the Gemara. Farmers, if you have a farm that produces dates, I guarantee you're not going to be letting in a bunch of kids to throw rocks and earth at your fruits. I guarantee you. That's not how you do it. Rav Papa says you kill 2 birds with 1 stone. With 1 throw, you've overcome 2 steps of the harvesting process. 2 melachos, you harvested, you cut it, and you extracted it from the general bunch. Now you can sell this individually. That's how I'm understanding based on the other commentaries that I'm reading. Let's just see the answer that the retort that Rav Ashi says. Rav Ashi says, I disagree. Rav Ashi Amar, ein derech tlisha bekach, ein derech prika bekach. This is not how you remove the whole cluster of fruits, and this is not how you remove an individual fruit. This is vild. It's going to damage the fruits. Nobody officially formed. This is not the way of the Malacha, and therefore Rav Ashi says you would not be chayiv. Not only you won't be chayiv with 2, you won't be chayiv with. You will not have even done 1. Let's read Rashi. Ein derech klisho prika bekach al yidei zurika. You don't throw stuff at fruits to remove them from the tree. What do? Ela oy biyad, oy bikli. You'll either use your own hand and pluck it, or you'll have a special tool that captures it. Detaching a fruit in the not conventional manner is throwing, and potter, you're exempt. So Rashi makes it clear there are ways to get a fruit off the tree. 2 ways. With your hand, with a long, those long telescoping poles. Nobody in their right mind who actually wants those fruits is going to throw at it, and therefore you're entirely off the hook. Now I need to add one more detail. Toilesh, what's the difference between, Rashi said toilesh, which is the removing of a fruit, and koitzer means harvesting. So what's the difference? So toilesh is usually the word for removing something by your hand, with your hand. Tlisha is detaching with your hand. Koitzer is with an implement. So the primary av melacha is, according to most commentators, using a vessel to harvest. The tulda, the byproduct, which is also prohibited, but it's a subcategory of harvesting, is harvesting by hand. And the truth is that certain kinds of harvesting, I think, is ideally done by hand, right? I think apples and other fruits in particular are usually done by hand, I believe. Right? People that are in the tri-state area may have seen apple trees. Floridians, we don't have apple trees.
You have berries.
You have berries and strawberries, and you can pick peppers.
Apples are picked by hand.
Apples are by
Picked by
hand.
hand, the
Right. So,
apples.
yeah, so each fruit has its primary way of harvesting. But tlisha is harvesting something that's typically done by an implement. So here it's kila'achar yad, it's the atypical manner, and it's not considered a malacha, period. Of course, to the professor and to Rebero and to others, if one was entirely not intending to remove the fruits, and this was purely a mistake or a wild swing or a throw, then of course you'd be exempt for different reasons, which is that's not even what your intention is. Now we have to decide: are you in a Rishus HaYachid? Are you in a Rishus HaRabim? But obviously, if you're in an orchard or a place in a grove where these trees are, you're probably not in the public domain. So the issue of Haitzah or causing something to travel for Amis is not the issue at hand. All right, so that concludes the third Melacha. So we have Zereya, which is planting, Chayresh, plowing, Koitzer, harvesting, which we've determined is with all different types of each industry with its varying words and techniques are all fall under the general category of Koitzer. Now we're going to go to the fourth item, which is Me'amer. As we know, we'll see in a moment, it's possible, or here in particular, I should say, every kind of product has a different process of how it's gathered. But Me'amer is describing the gathering of the grain into a bundle, which was the conventional way of bundling grain. I don't know today, but certainly for a long part of human history, and certainly biblically, right? We have, as I mentioned the first time we were reading the Mishnah, we have Yosef's dream. The brothers were ma'almim alumim, they were gathering bundles. So Me'amer here means gathering. Me'amer. Amar Rava says. So you notice there's less of we don't have a Tosefta that's going to give us different types of collecting, but Rava is going to, I think, is going to make the same point differently. He says like this: Hi man de konef milcha mi milchasa. A person who gathers salt from the salt place. Rabbi Steinsaltz says a salt pool. Chayev mishum ha'amer, the gathering of this product, although it's not even agricultural, it's not a vegetable, it's not a product, even that is considered ma'amer. Abaye says no. Ein imor ela begidule karka. Although me'amer is expansive, it describes all different types of collecting plant life, vegetation. We will not expand that melacha to include even other types of items, namely salt. So now is where I know what you're going to ask. Sometimes I can predict what's going to be asked. What about mushrooms? What's the din with mushrooms? Are mushrooms considered gidulei karka? They grow from the ground and therefore would be considered ma'amer? Or we know that mushrooms are not classified as plants. They're fungi, and it's a different process, and it's a different method, the way it works. So I don't know the answer yet. We can look it up, but I'm sure someone was having that question, so I just wanted to preemptively bring that forward. Any thoughts? Should you be chayiv with for mushrooms or not?
It's chayav for salty beef, which is definitely not a growing.
What?
It says a chayav for salt.
No, you're not. Well, Rava says you're chayiv. Abaye says you're not. According to Abaye, who says the definition of ma'amer is only vegetation. So what would you do with mushrooms? Are mushrooms considered vegetation or not?
Well, they are bar piyadama, right?
No. Well, what bracha do you make on a mushroom?
Piyadama?
I'm pretty sure you make a shehakal on mushrooms.
Oh, mushroom. Oh.
Anybody? Can someone back me up here?
Let me get the Brachos book. I'll check.
If it says Ha'adama, it's a mistake. I'm kidding.
If it disagrees with your
It
opinion,
disagrees with me, they made a mistake. So let me read for you a little commentary. Interesting. So the point that's
Brachos book says shall call for mushroom. Look at that.
oh, Baruch Hashem. You see, we learn something new every day.
Wow. I don't eat that many mushrooms, and I usually have them with other stuff.
So I don't know the answer, but I'm sure it's discussed. So there you have it. So what is the machlokas of Rava and Abaye? So possibly the machlokas is simple. Rava says, one second. Look at the activity. We're collecting salt. It's gathering. It's food. It should be included. Rava perhaps is saying no, because being that all melachos are informed by the Mishkan, what was done in the Mishkan, and in the Mishkan, whatever they used was gidulei karka. It was vegetation that grew from the ground. However, interestingly enough, there's a sefer that writes that perhaps the machlokes here is not if me'amer is exclusively gidulei karka, items that grow from the ground. Rather, it's a question of how we classify salt in the halachic conception. Do we look at salt ultimately as something that is growing forth from the ground? Perhaps Rava says, although it's very different, it's a different class, but maybe that too is considered growing from the ground. Now what I want to do is we're going to pull open the Shulchan Aruch in this discussion. And we're going to see that ultimately the halacha follows Rava. Hold on, let's do this. Asor, lekabetz, melach, mimisrafois, hamelach, which he says you cannot gather salt. He doesn't use the word that Rashi gives, which is a pool of salt. Rather, he says it's from a salt deposit. This has a resemblance to the act of me'amer, collecting the grain. Similarly, one is prohibited from gathering anything from the place where it grows. Anyone want to take a guess at how the Shulchan Aruch would paskin about mushrooms based on this reading?
Rabbi, I could see, because if you start to allow it, then you have to pack it, then you have to carry it, could lead you to all kinds of other things. You're not going to just go there, take salt in your salad.
Right. So here's the interesting thing. How do you think? This is just an exercise. I'm thinking aloud with you. So how do you think the Shulchan Aruch is paskin? Is he embracing the position of Rava, who says that you're not allowed to gather it because it's ma'amer? Or is he taking the position of Abaye that it's not ma'amer? And I'm going to say that the Shulchan Aruch is really hedging his bets. Because again, look at it. He says, Shadoim ma'amer. He doesn't say Shazehu ma'amer. Shadoim ma'amer. And so the commentary, starting with the Be'er to say, Imor Leika, it's not literally the Malach of Imor, because that's exclusively stuff that grows. This is similar enough that Lamaisa one shouldn't do it. And the Gra quotes those that say the same. It looks like Ma'amer, but it's not actually Ma'amer. Let's do one more thing. Let's look at the Magen Avraham. He says also, Abel Imor Leika, this is not literal Imor. Shein Imor Ela B'Gdulei Karka, he quotes our Gemara, quotes Abaye that says Imor would only be if it's vegetation. And the same would apply to Disha, to extracting threshing. And then he says, look at Shin Tazayin. So why do we pass him like Abaye? Not like Rava. All right, hold on. One more thing. Alan, is that your beautiful bird chirping in the background? You're making all of us want to join. You're making
I'm
all of
outside
us.
in the balcony.
You're making all of us want to join you.
Come.
Oh, here. So the Mishnah Berurah makes this point clearly, although all the other commentaries do. V'lachein asur midrabanan. This is rabbinically prohibited. Avol imar gufa leika. So we're poskening like Abaya, says the Mishnah Berurah, which is that although you shouldn't gather salt, you should. It's not because of a biblical prohibition. It's rabbinic because it's doime. It's akin. It's similar. It's reminiscent of gathering grain. Chen asur lekabetz kol davar. So interestingly enough, the Mishnah Berurah makes an important point over here. He says, first of all, what's called davar? What's everything? He says this would extend to fruits, vegetables, wood, grass, anything that grows from the ground. And he says you have to realize a lot of times we consider no one would think of pulling a fruit off the tree. No one would think of pulling something off the ground. But if they've fallen off on their own, are you allowed to gather them? And he says it's not so simple. If you have a garden, or if you have an orchard, be careful to not collect fruits that are on the ground, lest you actually hit another prohibition of ma'amer. Very
Isn't there also
interesting.
a problem that it fell on Shabbos?
I'm sorry?
The problem of no lot if it fell on Shabbos?
Yeah, it fell on Shabbos, but he said, even if it fell on Erev Shabbos, you would think that there's no issue whatsoever. Well, there's something you got to consider. Is it considered ma'amer? If it is or isn't considered ma'amer, that's another discussion. But let's just leave that for now. And so, my dear friends, I think this is going to conclude today's Gemara. I hope you found it informative and insightful. Yeah, because I think we finished. Hold on. Yeah, okay, we finished the item. Tomorrow, with Hashem's help, we're gonna resume with Dosh, which is again threshing, which is gonna lead us to more. What's the word? We're gonna stretch our imagination to visualize where Dosh might be applied, although it's done in a very different manner, and that's going to be tomorrow's Gemara with Hashem's help. I would like to thank our dear friends, awesome folks here who join us day in and day out and provide great wisdom and insight in interpreting and understanding the Gemara. Shkoyach for joining. Today, again, we dedicate our learning and prayers for a speedy recovery for Leah Basrita and health for all of Klal Yisrael. And in honor of Rebel's grandmother, you're going to have to remind us her name again. Mina
Basdov.
Mina Bastoi, her Neshama Shavan Aliyah. And should only have good news for all of Klal Yisrael. Shkoyach, all this concludes my remarks. I'd love to hear if anyone has any final comments. Feel free to chime in.
If you don't explain to me how mushrooms are not hadama, I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight.
Oh, well, I would not want you to not be able to sleep tonight. So,
It depends what kind of mushrooms you're smoking.
or ingesting. So here is what I understand. Mushrooms are very different in the way they grow and in the way they are planted from plants. Now, I am not good. I'm smart enough to not try to explain to a bunch of people of the sciences exactly how mushrooms work versus plants, but I know that they're different. So much so that the scientists classify them not even as plants, but as a fungi, right?
Right.
And so, therefore, even the scientists got it right. That there's something very, very different from fungi. So whereas I believe here's the difference. Plants have roots and they absorb their nutrients from the earth. Mushrooms are from spores that are given forth, but I don't think they penetrate the earth. And I'm not certain if they extract nutrients in the same way. And suffice it to say that Chazal understood that mushrooms are different. Mushrooms are different in their bracha, which is what triggered me to ask: would mushrooms, according to Rava, be considered? I'm sorry, would mushrooms, according to Abaya, be considered ma'amer? Abaya, who says the cutoff is gedulei karka, growing from the earth, what would he say about mushrooms? That's my question. I don't have the answer yet. I'm certain the answer is easy. We could probably Google it. I just didn't Google it yet. Before we hang up,
So that would be another issue, right?
I'm sorry.
Mushrooms are under the ground, so you have to dig them
No,
out.
they're not under the ground. Mushrooms are on the ground.
On the surface, yeah.
Most of them are grown in dark places, in pans, some sort of hydroponic way.
Because I used to have racehorses, and I'd go up to the farm every week, and I'd see piles and piles of manure. And I asked the trainer, I said, "What do you do with the manure?" He said, "They sell it to the mushroom farmers."
Mm.
So I always thought that it was
Anybody in the mood
government.
of anyone want to have some mushrooms now?
Yeah, and they grow. They for some reason they grow them in the dark.
And I'll tell you this: I have a problem. Some words are very hard to Google, and I'll tell you this: there's a lot of once you type in the word mushroom into your search bar, there's a lot of different mushrooms out there. Are mushrooms, but I'm sure it's a. Let's see if we.
Particular one that's one of the edible ones might help.
Rabbi, today when we have all this modern devices, etc., and people have to paskin for Shabbos, etc., do they try to go back to malacha of the